We are speaking on the 5th of November, which of course is Guy Fawkes Day. He's a revolutionary. He tried to blow up the parliament in England in the 1600s. But it's also, for me, the end of what I have come to call the season of reflection. Because as a Trinidad and Tobago citizen of African descent and somebody with my convictions, I think we need a different set of bearings and a different set of conceptions with which to think our situation through. So in the course of grappling with all of that, I came up with this notion called a season of reflection. And my season of reflection is to do with the things, if you like, that we've actuated to cause our own identity here. And the first day in the season of reflection, it's 2 months long, is on the 1st of August, which of course is emancipation. And in 1834, the enslaved Africans, they weren't slaves, they were enslaved Africans, were set free. 1834, the declaration of the end of slavery. And the second day, and that was supposed to represent a step towards recognizing the humanity of those people who were being formerly enslaved. Of course, we know there was confusion after that with emancipation, and then there was this sort of thing where they were supposed to go into being students and so on, pupils and so. And then we got up to the 31st of August. And the 31st of August, 1962, the country got its independence. And that was supposed to be us standing on our own 2 feet collectively and making steps in our own direction and so on. And I do believe it was in that Independence Day address, which is actually really interesting and important to read, the one that Dr. Williams gave 31st of August, 1962, where he spoke about no mother Africa and no mother India and a mother Trinidad and Tobago. So it's actually a very fertile speech, in my opinion, to reread. And now and again, I return to it, you know. And the third date in the season of reflection is the 24th of September, which of course is Republic Day, in which in 1976, we severed our ties, our formal ties to the crown. And our head of state became someone we selected. Whoever the person was, I think the first one was Sir Alice Clark, and at the moment is Excellency Paula May Weeks, okay, the first woman president of our country. But the idea being that we select our head of state. We're no longer subject to the situation where somebody becomes a head of state for our country merely by an accident of birth. So those 3 things, those 3 dates is interesting, eh? How in the course of the year, the 3 dates fall in a sequence that resembles the sequence of the events historically. So you go from 1834 on the 1st of January to 1962 on the 31st of August to 1976 on the 24th of September. And it's supposed to represent a progress and a development and a growth of our humanity and our selfhood. Yes? Into recognizing what is our capacity and our responsibility as a country. So that is just my introduction to say to you all that every year, I didn't do it this year because I don't have a column anymore. I stopped my newspaper column. And of course, we have COVID, which has totally changed all the bearings in the world. But every year, I have embarked on a especially serious series of essays during this season of reflection. Because I believe that we need to cast our own, as I say, our own navigational tools and our own bearings to make sense of what's happening around us in our society and in relation to our neighbors and so on. So I welcome this opportunity from UB to make this presentation and for us to discuss these important issues. Now, the whole issue of racism, race, cultural identity, and the question of who do we really think we are? And not just, as I always say, not just the thing, but the meaning of the thing. What do some of these phrases really mean? To be an African, or to be an Indian, or an Indo-Trimbegonian or an Afro-Trimbegonian or these sorts of varieties and phrases. And people say, I'm just a Trimbegonian. Okay? What does it all mean? Now, I want to say that one of the most powerful things culturally that keeps people in line, that maintains order, and that maintains standards is what I would call myths or legends, or some people would call them culture, just culture. So you have a culture of how you treat older people. You have a culture of how you treat the environment. You have a culture of how you treat with money and a whole lot of important elements in our life. According to where you're from and where your folks are from and how you grew up, you'd have a culture of how you deal with those things. And some of those things could be codified into myths, like old talks and legends and that kind of thing. The Papa Boa and Laja Bless and that kind of thing. And some of the myths are positive and they're necessary. So some of those things that we grew up and all of us got licks for them at some point. I suppose everybody would have grown up, maybe I'm showing my age. They would have gotten licks for it at some point or punished in some way. Those things were attempts by our parents and the generations before us to keep us on the right track and to make sure we do the right thing and we don't do the wrong thing. And looking back now, we could recognize some of that. Maybe not all, but some of it. But I also think that legends and myths have a function. And we have to recognize that that function is not always a healthy function. I mentioned about, when I started talking about legends and myths, I mentioned about the function of a legend or myth, keeping people under control and keeping things within a trend, yes? And keeping people under control and keeping things in a trend isn't always a positive thing. So that's the purpose of this discussion, this lecture I'm having with you all, to put forward some factual points, some examples, and to invite us to start to consider, and in fact, to use the academic language to interrogate what it is we really, really understand about race, about racism, about cultural, racial identity, okay? To start to examine some of those things. In Trinidad and Tobago, and for those of you who took the time to see that TED talk about, is it only white people who are racist? In Trinidad and Tobago, fortunately or unfortunately, we have a system of political parties, the two big dominant parties, regardless of whether you like it or you don't like it, they are the two big dominant parties, largely preach a sort of a very funny Anansi-ish kind of thing. So Anansi is not really dead and gone. On the one hand, they preach a kind of a national unity, all of we is one. And some parties make a point of appointing prominent people from a particular race in a prominent position. So for example, there was one time, I can remember it well, when the chairman of the PNM, I think was Franklin Kahn. And simultaneously, the chairman of the UNC was Jack Warner. So it was a kind of like, I don't know if you all could remember that. That was 5 or 6 years ago. It was kind of like, I just laughed. Because it's like, you know what I'm saying? It's not what it really is, but it's a show. So there's a kind of a way that all of we is one togetherness narrative is constantly promoted by both parties. But at the same time, there's also, we can't lie, there's also within that narrative, there are certain things that we need to actually deal with. And I believe that there are certain myths, I talked about myths and I talked about legends. There are certain myths and legends that are unhealthy. And we need to confront them. So for example, I would mention a few of them plainly, and I would attempt in the course of my presentation this evening to dismantle or debunk them, okay? So one of them is that East Indians or Hindus have a tremendous prowess at finance and business. They're very strong in business and finance. They have a commanding presence in the professions and so on, okay? And coming close behind that is the one where they talk about the capacity and the appetite for corruption and greed and so on. within that community. That is part of the conversation. I think it was on the 15th of October. Dr. Rowley spoke to a crowd at Pigot's Corner in Belmont, which is like a PNM stomping ground. And Dr. Rowley is very strong. He speaks very strongly, he speaks very clearly. I know he's not listening to this now, but maybe he'll listen to it later, so I'm speaking directly to him. He speaks very strongly and he speaks very clearly. And he was emphatic about the point of the UN only want to come back in power so they could thief money. He was distinctly repeated it several times. And he had all kinds of examples to support what he was saying and so on and so on. That's the kind of fella he is. That's how he speaks, okay? And correspondingly, there's another myth, which is interesting because it's promoted in a kind of interesting way by some of the very said Africans or Creoles, whichever phrase you want to use, Trinidadians of African descent or Creoles. And that is that, by and large, the African is lazy. The African lacks vision. The African lacks a commercial sense. The African lacks a business sense. And the African is being overtaken. When the Indian is in charge, and the French Creole is in charge, and the Syrian is in charge, and the Africans have nothing. And the people who are promoting it use a lot of those lines and those melodies from the African American struggle, you know, what do you call it? Taking a borrow. I can remember confronting one of them, and I'll give examples a little later to back up what it is I'm saying, because I think all of those things are ridiculous. I'm going to back up what I'm saying. So I'm not going to repeat the examples I gave in that TED talk when I spoke about, is it only white people who can be racist? I was asking a provocative rhetoric question. I'm not going to repeat all of that. I'm assuming that you all have seen that and you would agree or you would disagree with me. I'm going to give some fresh material now for consideration and discussion, okay? I can remember there's a citation from Dr. Williams saying, at some point, it would have been about 75 or 76, because he passed away in 81, April of 81. Same time as Bob Marley, really. Yeah, Dr. Williams gave a citation where he was saying that one of his successes as a leader of Trinidad and Tobago had been to keep the African and the Indian working class apart. I believe that is quoted in C.L.R. James' Party Politics in the West Indies and the Harney book, Stefano Harney book. You all would have been given those readings earlier on in this course, okay? And what we are really examining, I'm going to say it quickly now, and I will return to it at the end. We are examining a set of neo-colonial arrangements in which one's suitability for leadership is measured by A, your willingness to talk stupidness and confuse the position, and B, your willingness and your ability to do wickedness to your own people. So there's a metric of leadership in this neo-colonial time and space. And we are subjected, because these people have all the money, they can put as much advertisements as they want, they can go on TV, they flood up Facebook with their people, and we know the story. We all live into it. And I am hoping to give some discussion today so we can get some landmarks or points of reference so you can navigate out of this and interrogate this storm of foolishness. So the kind of issue I would like to bring forward in relation to the question of the Indian excellence in business and the African awfulness at business and so on. The kind of example I would like to go on, and it's a very useful example because we have to be alert in history. All the way through history, in established regimes, there's a mask in place. You all are doing cultural studies, there's a mask in place. In other words, the mass shows us things as they are meant to be seen and not necessarily as they really are. And occasionally, if one is alert, occasionally in history, there may come a moment when the mass slips. And if we are alert and we are committed, we can actually dive in and pull out some material and pull out some learning and understanding and see what is really going on. And I believe such a moment occurred, a kind of a blip, a warp. At the end of 08, in the year 08 it started, which was the year that Hindu Credit Union went down. They went down in April. At the end of that year, CL Financial went down. And because CL Financial was bailed out at the end of January of 09. And two of the country's extremely large and extremely important financial institutions were seriously affected. That was bad enough. But because of the size of the thing, the ruling group, which is the PNM was in power at that time, the ruling group felt it was necessary to conduct a certain part of the thing in public. So they kept press conferences and they were talking about it and they were announcing this and they were announcing that. So people like myself who have been waiting for this moment were scooping up information because it's one of my big areas of study. And I actually think the CL Financial Group was really badly managed. That's why it collapsed. The collapse had nothing to do with what happened in America. What happened in America was a happy coincidence for them because they could say Wall Street this and Wall Street that. It was nothing to do with Wall Street. Okay. But in fact, when you look at CL Financial, you get an actually startling insight into the true affairs of the country. What you have is a situation where the biggest bank in the Caribbean is Republic Bank, the one on Park Street. That's the biggest bank in the whole Caribbean. And the majority shareholder of Republic Bank was CL Financial. Okay. The biggest insurance company the Caribbean has ever had was CLICO, which is owned by CL Financial. The second biggest liquor company in the Caribbean was Angostura, which is another company owned by CLICO. Okay. The biggest downstream energy producer was Methanol Holdings, also owned by CLICO in partnership with a German company called Ferrostal. And fifthly, the biggest real estate portfolio in the country was owned by a company called Home Construction, which is wholly owned by CL Financial. At this point, you have to say, wait. What about that narrative about Black people can't do business? Because there's certain narratives that cannot survive contact with the facts. Let me be perfectly clear with you all. I'm not suggesting that I admire CLICO or that they did no wrong. The company was horribly mismanaged. Okay? They went too far strategically in certain directions. The main people in CL Financial, as far as I'm concerned, and I've written it 100 times, should be behind bars. So let's be really clear what it is I'm saying. I'm not in any big admiration here. I'm just saying that regardless of whether I admire them or I don't admire them, those accomplishments I've listed are an irrefutable part of the record. And in fact, they destroy the notion that there's some fatal deficit in terms of the size of businesses or anything like that. One could go further. And one could even ask, what are the regional conglomerates? Okay, what are the regional conglomerates controlled by East Indians? Which ones are they? They're different business models. Okay, we'll go further. And it's important to understand that CL Financial started off as CLICO in 1936. two young men called Cyril, one from Trinidad, Cyril Dupree, one from St. Lucia called Cyril Monsanto. They met in New York, in Harlem. They used to sell cheap insurance. And they decided, you know, we could do this. And they went back to Trinidad and started an insurance company on Queen Street. They used to rent a place upstairs of a shop in Queen Street. And check it. When they started, the people they hired as salesmen, when they were trying to sell to the poorer people in Port of Spain, used to be chased away with the refrain, I'm not buying any insurance from all you. Insurance is white people business. I'm not buying any insurance from a black person. They had to fight up a hill in 1936 to get to where they got to before they collapsed. Okay, all of that is in the history of CLICO. It's all on my blog as well. Okay. So there's a real issue we're grappling with here. What's also interesting is that when the company collapsed in January of 2009, that was the official bailout, which the Minister of Finance signed. Again, I'm on the record as saying that that bailout is probably the most corrupt thing the Caribbean ever signed. You had the Minister of Finance signing a bailout agreement on the 30th of January 2009. The request for the bailout was received on the 13th of January, 17 days. The cabinet was able to approve the bailout in 17 days. And what is more, the Minister of Finance signing the bailout was a shareholder in the company being bailed out. Okay? These are facts. She can't tell me anything. These are facts on the register of shareholders. Okay? In addition, the bailout was a blank check. There was never any amount agreed. Well, we're going to lend you 1 billion or 2 billion. There was no interest agreed. And in fact, none of the principals of CL who had been responsible when the company crashed, none of them had to sign over their personal assets. So Mr. Dupree, Mr. Montai, all of those big names you all know, they kept everything. If you had 20 houses, you kept 20 houses. We as the taxpayer, we got stuck with the burden. Now that, as far as I'm concerned, is the most corrupt thing we have ever signed down here in the Caribbean, which is saying a lot. And let's pause and examine the horns, to use that old-fashioned saying, examine the horns. So we talk about, I mentioned it as one of the myths, the myth about the particular corruption of East Indians, and so I mentioned it earlier on, which I reject. If you take a clean sheet of paper, pardon me, and you were to write down the top 20 names of the top 20 people who controlled CL Financial and who regulated it, they were all people who look like me, people of African descent. There was possibly one person you could stretch the list and include as a 21st person, one person who was Indian. The whole scene, from the governor of the central bank to the Minister of Finance to the man who was prime minister when anything was agreed, the whole scene didn't have any Indians controlling it. Okay. So we have a situation where racism could permeate a situation to the extent that people are not even seeing what is actually happening. Okay? That is what actually happened in this country. This is not who say, he say, she said. These are actual things. People's name is there. And that sort of racism is very unhealthy for us because it gives us a warped view of what is happening. And of course, a lot of this information, the information I've been speaking about CL Financial and the Hindu Credit Union, was part of the story too. The Hindu Credit Union was run by Mr. Harry Hanarain. And Mr. Hanarain, to his credit, he's not one of my friends, one of my enemies, but to his credit, He testified at the Commission of Inquiry. He testified for a week under oath. He answered all the questions. Some of the answers were hilarious, but he answered everything. He stood up there and he took his licks. The other two didn't take their licks. Pause a second and think about it. Mr. Dupree and Mr. Montai both hired senior attorneys. In the case of Mr. Montai, it was that famous newspaper columnist, Mr. Martin Daly, senior counsel. In the case of Mr. Dupree, it was the English QC, Andrew Mitchell. And they took every point not to testify, to avoid to self-incriminate. They never went to the witness stand, they never explained nothing. Okay? Mr. Imbert confirmed about 3 weeks ago, it's $30 billion of our money has gone to bail out this company. And the two chiefs have steadfastly refused to explain anything. Okay? So there's the myth of who's really, really corrupt and who's really, really smart and bright with money. And then there's the reality. And to give the thing in proportion for you all, the CL Financial I just mentioned was 30 billion. The Hindu Credit Union is $500 million. I think it's either 485 or 495 million. Just to put things, actual numbers on the table. Okay? Because political rhetoric is a hell of a thing. And that is what we are living through, and we're trying to decipher that. I also want to mention that the Coleman Commission of Inquiry actually prepared 2 reports because it was asked to examine 2 things. The 2 things were related, but they were in a way they were separate. One thing was the collapse of Hindu Credit Union, and the other thing was the collapse of CL Financial. And the way life operates sometimes is almost like a synchronicity and a pattern. Of course, Anthony Coleman is now dead. He passed away a couple of years ago. But I could tell you, his report on Hindu Credit Union was completed in June of 2014. June of 2014. Hindu Credit Union, Mr. Harry Hanarayan. And despite all of the political rhetoric and its racist rhetoric, I will say it is racist rhetoric coming from the PNM side about the corruption of the UNC and they want to thief money. To her credit, Mrs. Prasad Besesa, the next day, laid the report in Parliament. Anybody who wants to see what happened at Hindu Credit Union, go on the website tonight, ttparliament.org. Ask for the HCU report by Coleman. You'll see it. Mrs. Prasad Besesa filed it in Parliament the next day. 10 out of 10 points for that. Dr. Rowley, on the other hand, because there's a particular difficulty with the PNM cabinet, I'll get to that just now. Dr. Rowley, on the other hand, received Mr. Coleman's completed report on CL Financial on the 22nd of June, 2016. And they received it and they were in cabinet discussing it. And I will mention something. Of the institutions that collapsed within CL Financial, one was called Clico Investment Bank. Clico Investment Bank was proven by an affidavit sworn by the Inspector of Financial Institutions in April of 2010 to have not filed any tax returns for 3 or 4 years before they got a huge bailout, okay, of about $4 to $5 billion. The current Attorney General, and I can say this again, there's nothing he can say, I've written it in the papers, the current Attorney General, Faris Al-Rawi, was on the board of Clico Investment Bank at all those times. So who's zooming who? So Dr. Rowley and the cabinet received the report from Mr. Coleman on the 22nd of June, 2016. And on the 1st of July, 2016, Dr. Rowley gives an epic speech to Parliament, in which he explains that because people have to be prosecuted and the DPP has to investigate this and investigate that, they're not going to publish a report. Okay? So the report, practically speaking, has slid into oblivion. Okay? We never really know what was said. And in fact, it begs the question, because the report on Hindu Credit Union also called for prosecutions with a lot of details about who should be, because a lot of bubble took place at HCU. But for some reason, Mrs. Prasad Besesa placed a higher value This is my interpretation. On the question that not only must the right thing be done, but the right thing must be seen to be done. And to her credit, she placed it on the public record. Public money was spent paid on the organization. The public can't be the last one to know. Dr. Rowley took a different view. And the Coleman report into CL Financial remains concealed up to this date. Okay? And quite frankly, I don't expect we'll ever see it. I don't work with leaks and so I don't want anybody to give me a copy by a leak or something. I don't expect we'll ever see it. Those bodies are too big, and it was really too big to fail. And in a kind of way, all of them are too big to go to jail. So they're publishing a report at all. That report is real trouble. I think what it is I'm saying in relation to the racism dialogue, the racism narrative around our political class. I gave the examples in the TEDx talk. I'm giving a worked series of examples here. And another thing I want to say about CL Financial, I just remembered something. I did a series of freedom of information requests and sued the state, the Ministry of Finance at various times, to get details of the CL Financial bailout, who got money and so on. And I was successful in getting details about something called the EFPA, the Executive Flexible Premium Annuity. And by details, I mean I got all the names of who received money back. It is 13,200 names I got sent to me by the Chief State Solicitor. And you will be shocked to know how many people on that list were East Indian people who had major investments. So the notion of a lack of commercial sense or lack of financial sense on the part of Africans, or some higher commercial sense on the part of Indians and a higher financial sense, that notion is tremendously disturbed by the pattern of investment within the CL Financial portfolio, the EFPAs. One person, one individual, probably the wealthiest East Indian woman, businesswoman in the country, she had $167 million with Dupree. Okay. Some families had 50 million, 60 million, 70 million. Okay. When I write this up in a book, these details will be given with an analysis of it. But it actually illustrates very clearly to me that that notion that is broadcast so often to us and is a racist notion, that notion that the Africans not really good at business and not really good at finance, and the Indians are really good at it, it's not actually supported by the record. It's not supported by the record. In the case of Mr. Hanarain and Mr. Dupree, Mr. Hanarain was a trade union leader who became involved in selling financial products when he took up trading as an insurance salesman with Mr. Dupree. And in fact, when Hindu Credit Union was in its heyday, Hindu Credit Unions were taking deposits from its members and passing those to Mr. Dupree to reinvest. Okay, all of that came out in the Commission of Inquiry. Very interesting. Now, I want to change gears slightly and deal with one of the aspects of the narrative. Because so far we've been talking about speeches, political speeches and that kind of thing, yeah? And one of the aspects of the narrative that I haven't seen really dealt with is the whole question of the use of state violence or official violence. Okay? I started off by saying that what we're seeing here before us is a metric in this neo-colonial time to establish leadership. You have to A, be willing to talk foolishness and cause confusion, and B, be willing to show you could brutalize your own people. Yep, and you'd be allowed into office. If you're talking about united, no. If you're really talking about that, they will take you out. And we have seen many examples. You all get it in the lessons, and so I wouldn't spend time on it. So I could go back, and I'm just going over a short period here. There are many deeper examples one could give. I gave the example about Dr. Williams with 1975 and 1970 and so on. And I could go back and say that I could remember my my erstwhile friend and colleague, Dr. Kublal Singh, Wayne Kublal Singh, who had the hunger strike with the highway reroute movement. And I was president of JCC at the time. We were heavily involved with Wayne and trying to do the Armstrong report and all of that stuff to examine the viability of the highway and so on and so on. And I could remember in June 2012, there were some women, middle-aged women, East Indian women, who were affiliated with the highway reroute movement, who had a peaceful protest outside of the Poverty Hindu School, where Mrs. Prasad Besesa went to have a meeting to speak to the PTA and so on. And these ladies were sitting in the road and effectively they were blocking the Prime Minister. Peaceful protest kind of thing. And the police were called and they were picked up and bodily slung into police vehicles. And Dr. Rudal Monilal, was asked a short while afterwards, what did he have to say about that? Was he disturbed by it? Now, what you got to get about this highway is the source of the dispute, where the biggest protests were, the source of the dispute was directly in the constituencies, because they're neighboring constituencies of Mrs. Prasad Besesa and Dr. Monilal. When Dr. Monilal had been in opposition, and Mr. Manning had been Prime Minister, he had supported the highway reroute movement and had asked for consultation and all sorts of things. But of course, times change and so do we. So he was asked, what did you think about the women at the Poverty Hindu School who were picked up by the police and thrown into the police vehicles? And his response was, I didn't see any problem. All I saw was a lot of bags of aloo. Now, to me, it was kind of disturbing. It was kind of distasteful. And it spoke to me about a level of violence, in this case, verbal violence, following the police picking up somebody and throwing them into a van, effectively against your own people. If you want to divide things that way, if you want to persist with the racial narrative, it's a degree of showing I could be hard on my own people. And then last week, I think it was last week, Monday, we had a lovely moment where, in fact, after 8 years of litigation, we had Justice James Abood gave a judgment in the court case that the highway reroute movement brought against the state. And the case is one of these abstruse, arcane, almost ephemeral kind of things. They were suing for breach of promise. They were suing for a series of things that in law we call reasonable expectations. And reasonable expectations is a concept in law, is when someone in official power has made you or your organization understand that they will do this or they won't do that. Yes? And the one boundary, there are two rules for it. One rule is that the person who made the promise, the official or the official body, has to have behaved as if the promise was real. So it wasn't a one-off remark. Yes? You can't trap the whole of TNTech because somebody in TNTech talked foolishness one night. Yes? Everybody makes mistakes. We all do. But it has to be a pattern of behavior in support of an official promise. And secondly, that pattern of behavior in the official promise have to be rooted in law. It can't be something illegal. Those are the two sorts of, a quick sketch of what the test is. And Wayne and the group took the state to court in 2012. It took 8 years to get judgment. And Justice Abood's ruling was delivered last week, Monday, on the 26th. 62 pages long, and I read it because I had been in the middle of the events, trying to negotiate for the hunger strike and the Armstrong report, and for NIDCO to implement the Armstrong report. I was in the middle of the thing for 3 or 4 years. So I read it with great interest. And it's remarkable how clear Justice Abood puts the positions. So there was a position where the army and the police went, apart from the Bagabalu thing, there was a night when the army and the police, under the command of Jack Warner, who was then the Minister of National Security, when the army and the police went to the Kubla things at a camp down in Dibe, blocking part of where the highway was supposed to go. And the instruction was, go there at 4:30 in the morning and break down the whole place and carry everybody down. And they did that. Okay. All of that is in Justice Abood's ruling. What a disappointment, considering that in 2012, we sat, and I'm saying we because I was in the meeting, we sat with Jack Warner. Okay. George Emmanuel George was permanent secretary. He became a minister later. Okay. All of us sat together trying to find a way out of this apparent impasse on a matter of tremendous concern. It was the biggest single project in the country. In fact, the biggest single project in the country's history. For people who want the context, 7.2 billion is the biggest single thing the country has ever built. It wasn't a small thing. It wasn't a fight of egos. It was a fight of tremendous importance. Yet, in the case of the police and the army breaking down the camp and beating everybody, and if you see Dr. Kubla, if you ever met him, you'd realize what an awful thing that is, because he's about 85 pounds soaking wet. Poor fella. He's small so. Marasmi is the word we used to use long time. Okay? And to brutalize them that way, in a way, and I'm putting something out here, I don't have proof, but I'm bringing examples in support of my theory. I doubt that Mrs. Prasad Bisesa and Dr. Moonilal and people like that, in other words, people of intelligence who have political power at that point in time, would have carried out those actions against people belonging to the other race, against Africans. I'm putting that there. Okay? They could do that because it's their own people. And there's a kind of a way you want to show you're strong enough to discipline your own children. It ties into so many other things. And then we go forward and we get to the point where, we have Shabaka Kambon at UB. Shabaka Kambon is the son of Afra Raymond, who of course is the Black Power pioneer from 1970. Shabaka Kambon speaking out at a Rhodes Must Fall campaign meeting here on campus. I'm saying here, I'm just being whimsical because of course none of us are here, we're all somewhere else, we're virtual. But at UB's campus, 30th of November 2017, and challenging particular things that I think it was, what's his name? The man who runs UB, Professor Bayan, yeah, Copeland, yeah, I remember the name now. And being roughed up by the security, put out of the meeting. Again, I asked the question if Dr. Tiwari was running UB. You see? Or if Mrs. Prasad Bisesa was Prime Minister. Trust me, they would have found another way. Because they always have other ways to deal with things. Mr. Kambon didn't have a gun in his waist or a knife in his hand. They always have other ways to deal with things. But let's move on. And then we have, in October 2018, I believe also here, and I'm using it here whimsically again, there was a protest at UB, organized by students and the Student Guild, to do with campus security, I believe. Those of you on campus could correct me if I'm not getting it quite right, but I believe it was a protest asking for a better level of campus security. And that protest would have taken place near the south gate of the UB, yeah? And the thing is that that protest took place in a situation where the students were protesting outside the south gate of the campus. And from what I saw on video, the police charged in, and two of the young men, two young black men, it so happens, were pinned to the ground. I have a picture of them pinned to the ground with their necks on the ground and the knees on their neck. The one where you can't breathe. Black Lives Matter. It's kind of, yeah. But who's the Prime Minister? Who's the head of UE? I can tell you if Mrs. Prasad Bisesa was Prime Minister, it wouldn't have happened like that. They would have found another way. Okay. There's always another way to settle these things. You say students were, the head of UE was a fellow called Darian Narain. At that time, the head of UB's guild. And the two young men who were beaten and arrested were Nathaniel John and Brian Richards. We have to remember their names. We have to remember their names. That is respect. Because one of them actually had the guts, and at least said the gall, the guts to stand up in a meeting and confront the next month and confront Commissioner Griffiths and say to him, he still doesn't know why he was arrested. A month later, he didn't know why he was arrested. Why was I put in handcuffs? Why was I taken away? And Griffiths made something about them blocking the road and it wasn't a legal protest and something, and maintaining law and order. That, you all heard this speech before. I don't have to repeat it. You know the one. Yeah? He is there to uphold the law and so on and so on. All you know the one, right? Good. You give a kind of thing. But it's in the papers. So these young men have to give them the respect. So we remember their names and the date. And I could tell you all, when the thing finally reached the court in July 2020, the matter was thrown out. They prevailed in court, okay? So there's no stain against their name. As far as I'm concerned, there's honor against their name. They stood up for the right thing. But episodes like this could cause us to interrogate what is really, really going on. And then, of course, in mid-2020, the same year we're in, we had a situation with the police shooting, and the commissioner of police called it a shooting, so I'm not saying anything he didn't say. We had a situation with the police shooting 3 young black men in Caledonia, just part of Mova, Eastern Mova, Southeast Mova. And the protests that followed from that was dealt with a very hard hand. Tear gas. There was a woman who was pregnant who was shot. It claimed that she was shot by the police. Okay. There was a lot of violence. After a few days, it seemed to have petered out. But again, I ask the question, cast your minds back. Let's snap out of the 9-day memory. You could imagine anything so happened when Mrs. Prasad Bisesa was Prime Minister? Shooting by black people and tear gas? No, they'd find another way. They always find another way. There are a lot of ways and means to deal with these things, okay? There are a lot of ways and means. And I have a lovely picture here of the whole situation, and I want to show it to you all. Yeah, can I share my screen? Let's see. Okay, we have some chats here. I'm not looking at you all. I remember knee to neck. Okay, good. So we're getting it. Okay, fine, nice. Let me say one more thing to you all in relation to the matter we're discussing. And that thing relates to the question of funding and the question of funding for culture. A great part of my work has been devoted to how do we fund and how do we spend public money? How do we spend state funds? And accountability for that spending. And we are going to use this to examine some of those myths. So another one of the myths that is often bandied about is that when the Indian government is in power, UNC, I guess they mean, that the money is there and is spent to support their people and the money goes into their community and they build up themselves and so on and so on. And when the African government is in power, I suppose they mean the PNM, the black government, that they spend things to support themselves and their own supporters and so on and so on. So I was very pleased about 3 weeks ago that a friend of mine, I would mention who it is, a person called Nigel Campbell. And Nigel has done some serious research and analysis of the whole intersection between culture and the state and how the state supports culture. His work is at iRadioTT.com. And this piece of research he did, he examined the period of 2010 to 2019, which is a decade. Of course, we can't do 2020 because we're still in 2020. And 2020 is such a strange year, it's like an outlier. But 2010 to 2019 are useful because it examines a decade. And interestingly, for 5 years of that decade, the PNM was in power. And for 5 years of that decade, the UNC was in power under the umbrella of the People's Partnership. So that's the 10 years we examined. Nigel did the work. The source document he got was the actual figures of expenditure from something called the Official Estimates of Expenditure, published by the Ministry of Finance and the Economy. That's an annual publication. So it's an official publication from the beginning of time, like 100 years, 100 and something years. And what Nigel was examining was the subventions paid to the National Carnival Commission. And I'm going to try to put this on the screen. Thank you. What we're seeing here is a breakdown from the years 2010 to 2019. The fifth column is the one that is of decisive interest, because in the fifth column I've broken the numbers down by color. So for the year 2010, Carnival would have been in the first part of 2010, and that money would have been spent in 2010. So it's 122 million. The next year, 2011, the People's Partnership was in power and they maintained the level of funding. They went up a bit, they went up by about 850,000. The year 2012, they sort of tripled the funding to 360. The year 2013, the total funding was 556. 200,000 was spent in 2013. And in 2014, 170,000 was spent. The total funding during the period of the partnership was $1.04 billion. The period of the PNM's period in office, which started in 2016 up until now, the funding is steadily going along, declining. And in fact, in a total 10-year period, we have an expenditure of $1.787 billion, 58% of which was spent during the partnership's period in office, and 42% of which was spent during the PNM's period in office. There's further research on this as to other cultural organizations. But there was only 1 year, I think it was when that chap, Lincoln Douglas, was Minister of Culture. He's passed away since. But Lincoln Douglas in 1 year actually published what organizations got what money. And that was of great interest. But the next year, his civil servants shut him down. So he was never allowed to do it again by his own civil servants. So it's just all we have is these sorts of totals. And we can only pull a festival like Carnival because there's one body that funds Carnival, which is NCC. Okay, so NCC would distribute money to other bodies. This indicates that the notion that we may have embraced in terms of who's funding what and who's favoring what, those notions, yeah, I'm seeing somebody put the figure 2014. Those notions don't survive very well contact with the records and contact with reality. Because that what I gave you there is the actual figures. It was actually spent and money actually given to the NCC. The further breakdown was not possible. Somebody, I think Malene Joseph, put the point on and said that in fact it was just 1 year. She thinks it was 2014. So there was a year that Dr. Douglas published that, and that was really useful for us. But we were never able to go any further because it just shut him down. So that actually, that fight over information takes place. Huh? Now, let me come back to my remarks here. Yeah. So I want to say that what I'm inviting us to consider is that these notions of stereotypes, these notions of stereotypes and easy conclusions. It's almost like a cartoon, like cowboys and Indians. So black people, which is a code word for Africans, are like this, and Indian people are like that, and it just really isn't so. Okay, it really isn't so. Our own history could tell us it isn't so, and we need to understand why it is painted as so, and understand there's nothing innate about Africans and Indians. If you go to Nigeria, where to outside Trinidadian eyes, everybody down there would look alike. I mean, they're all Africans, right? They have different political parties and people are fighting along different national lines that some of us may want to call, if we use a Eurocentric phrase, tribal. Okay. Why are they fighting? They're all alike, right? And different parts of the world, we have this phenomena where, in fact, these differences are erected and they're forced to flourish, and we are forced to engage on those terms. And I'm trying to offer you all some alternative ways to look at it. The last example I would give you is the example of the Dolce gang. Now, Mr. Pandey was elected after the 1717 coup at the end of 95. And Mr. Pandey was the leader of the group. Mr. Ramesh Lawrence Maharaj was his attorney general. I wouldn't lie, I had plenty of admiration for both of them at the time. I wouldn't lie. And one of the big cases that rocked the country was the whole thing with the Dolce thing. And they killed the Babulal family, and they were held, and they were witnesses, and there was a whole thing on a trial. And eventually, they were sentenced to death. I think it was 9 of them were sentenced to death. And I have never been in support of the death penalty. And if you know how the death penalty works, people aren't hung or they aren't executed in a strict rotation to do it when you went on death row. In Trinidad and Tobago, the cabinet has to decide that we are hanging that person. When the cabinet has made that decision, the Attorney General prepares a paper called a death warrant. That death warrant, under the signature of the Attorney General, goes to the President. The President then signs the death warrant and is then sent to the Commissioner of Prisons, who then has the legal authority to hang the particular individual. What took place in the Dolce case is that fellas who had just been sentenced, I think their sentence might have been a year or 2 before, okay, found themselves with death warrants executed and on the slippery road to being hung. I protested about it. I wrote in the papers about it. I had articles and so. But 99% of Trinidad and Tobago believes in the death penalty. I'm just one voice in the wilderness. And they hung them. And I asked the question in terms of official brutality. Because it's clear to me that Mr. Pandey did that to show that he was serious about crime. It was fair about the rise and murder rate and so on. I asked the question, would Mr. Pandey and Mr. Ramesh Maharaj, in an attempt to show they were serious about crime, have gone into death row and picked 9 Africans and hung them in one weekend? You see? But you could do certain things onto your own and still get marks and come out and high up in the class. And that sort of approach is actually causing us as far as I'm concerned, a lot of issues we have to deal with in our country. And I thank you for your attention. I'm going to pause here. I know we have to take time for Q&A. So I would open myself to questions and thank you for your attention.